You have prayed, you have believed, you have shown up on the days when showing up cost you something significant. And yet here you are, still in the pressure, still carrying the weight, music, still waiting for the ground beneath your feet to feel solid again. This is not a crisis of faith. It is something quieter and in some ways harder. The slow erosion of a person who has done everything right and is still standing in the gap between music, what they believe, and what they can see. But Jesus never promised his followers an exemption from storms. Read Matthew 7 carefully. In verse 24, he does not say the wise builder avoids the rain. He says the rain fell on that house, the wind blew, the torrents came, and it did not fall because it had been built on rock. The promise was never about the absence of pressure. It was always about what holds when the pressure arrives. And then John 16:33, one of the most direct things Jesus ever said, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Not you will possibly encounter music difficulty, not some of you may face hard seasons. You will have trouble. It is stated as plainly as a weather report. What follows it is not a strategy or a system, but is a person. Take heart, I have overcome. What this message is about is not trying harder or believing more intensely, but is about understanding what Jesus actually practiced. Music, the specific interior postures he modeled that made him unshakable under the music kind of pressure that would have dissolved anyone else. These are not techniques. Music. They are not steps. They are the hidden architecture of a life that holds. By the time we reach the end of this, you will not just have heard something. You will understand something about how strength actually works that the world has never been able to teach you, because the world has never had access to the source. 1. The strength that begins where effort ends. Every system the world offers for becoming strong begins in the same place, with you. Try harder, push further, build better habits, develop more discipline, cultivate a stronger mindset. The underlying assumption is always the same: music. The resource you need is somewhere inside you, and the path to it runs through greater effort. But Jesus went to Gethsemane and dismantled that assumption completely. Matthew 26:39, he went a little farther, fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as music I will, but as you will." This is the Son of God at the moment of maximum pressure, or he is hours from the cross. He knows exactly music what is coming, and what he does is not summon inner reserves, steel himself through discipline, or declare victory over the situation. He falls on his face. Music. He admits he does not want what is ahead, and then he releases his own will entirely. Heaven reads Gethsemane as the most powerful music moment in the gospel. The world reads it as the most vulnerable. Here is the spiritual principle that Gethsemane reveals. Control produces fragility. Surrender produces stability. The person who holds everything tightly, who needs outcomes to cooperate, who has built their peace on circumstances remaining favorable, that person can be broken by almost anything. Remove one support and the structure wobbles. Remove two and it falls. But the soul that has handed its will, music, to God has nothing left to lose to the storm, because it has already released what the storm music is trying to take. This is not passivity. Jesus was the most purposeful person who ever walked the earth. What he surrendered in the garden was not his engagement with music life. It was his insistence on controlling its outcomes. He said, in effect, "I trust you more than I trust my own preference for how this ends." And that single act of release is what made everything that followed possible. Isaiah 40 verse 31 carries this music's same truth from a different angle. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Notice what the strength is connected music to. Not effort, not discipline, hope in the Lord, which is another way of saying trust, music, extended toward one who holds what you cannot control. The strength is renewed, not manufactured. It arrives from outside. It flows into the person who has stopped trying to generate it themselves. There is a practical dimension to this worth naming. The person who has not yet learned to surrender will keep returning to the same exhaustion cycle, striving until depletion, recovering briefly, music, then striving again from a slightly lower baseline. Each round costs more than the last. Music. Each recovery takes longer. The reason is not weakness of character or lack of music faith. It is that they are drawing from the wrong source. Human reserves, however deep, are finite. They were never designed to sustain the weight of a life fully lived. But the source that opens when you release control, when you genuinely say, "Not my will, but yours," that source does not deplete. It replenishes. It renews. Not because of anything you have done to earn the renewal, but because the one who provides it does not run out. Paul understood this from the inside. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 8. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. That sequence is not the description of a person who avoided pressure, but is the description of a person who passed through pressure repeatedly without being finished by it. Hard-pressed, perplexed, persecuted, struck down, and still standing. Not because the circumstances were manageable, but because the source of his stability was not located inside the circumstances. Music. Surrender is not the moment you give up. It is the moment you stop carrying what was never yours to carry and discover that the weight you release is immediately taken up by hands far more capable than yours. That is where the unshakable life begins, not in greater effort, in deeper release. And every time you return to this posture, every time you choose release over control in a situation where control feels necessary, the stability deepens. Not because you are becoming stronger in yourself, but because the roots are going further down into the one who does not shake. What forms in a person through consistent surrender is not skill or willpower or resilience in the conventional sense. It is something quieter and far more durable. A life built on a foundation that the storms were never designed music to reach. What happens before dawn that nobody sees? Mark 135 records one of the most quietly significant music details in the entire gospel. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place, music, where he prayed. Read what surrounds that verse. The day before, Jesus had healed the sick, cast music out demons, and ministered to an entire town gathered at Simon's door. The demand on him was total. The crowd would return. More people needed healing, more opposition was building, and before any of it resumed, before a music single person was awake to watch, he withdrew. Well, he was full of the Holy Spirit. He had just demonstrated supernatural authority over sickness and darkness. And he still felt the vital need to step away from everything, the crowd, the expectation, the next task, and find the face of the Father in the silence. None of that is incidental detail. It is the operating principle behind every public moment he ever had. Matthew 6:6. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. The hidden place is not a spiritual luxury for people with spare time. It is the source from which everything visible flows. What is built with God in music, the invisible, is what sustains you in the visible, not what you perform in public, not the declarations you make in front of others. What happens in the room where only God is present. There is a reason the enemy works hardest to keep you away from this place, not because it is dramatic, it rarely is, because it is music formative. The solitary place is where God shapes what no external circumstance will later be able to music break. A man worked night shifts at a warehouse for several years. 12 hours alone, no one coming, nothing to manage except the silence and the dark. Well, he started bringing Clear's Throat a Bible in his second year, not out of devotion, out of boredom. There, music was nothing else to do. Well, Slowly, without any decision he could point to, those hours became something he depended on. By year 4, he could not imagine the shift without them. He never told anyone what was happening in those overnight hours. His wife noticed the change in him before he had words for it himself. She asked what had shifted. He did not have a clean music answer, only that something in him had become quieter than it used to be, austerer, less reactive to things that used to move him. He had not planned a spiritual music discipline. He had simply been left alone with God long enough for something to form. That is what the solitary place music does. It does not require a perfect method or a prescribed length of time or a spiritual vocabulary you have not yet developed. It requires only the consistent choice to be music present to God before you are present to anything else. And what forms in that choosing, over weeks, over months, over years, is not information, music, or skill. It is a kind of interior settledness that becomes increasingly difficult to locate music and disrupt. The person who has been meeting God in secret develops a center that the day cannot relocate. They carry into the noise something that was built in music, the quiet, and it holds in ways they cannot always explain and do not always music need to. 1 Kings 19:11-12 tells us that when Elijah stood on the mountain before the Lord, God was not in the great wind that tore the mountains apart, but he was not in the earthquake. He was not in the fire. After the fire came a gentle whisper. That is where he was. And the person who has never learned to inhabit the silence will always miss what God is saying, because he rarely raises his voice above it. Public strength is formed in private. What you carry into the difficult music day was built in the unhurried hours when nothing else was watching. Jesus knew this, practiced it without fail, and the consistency of his public authority was the direct fruit of it. Go to the solitary place, music. Stay longer than feels productive. The formation that happens there is the most important work of your music spiritual life. 3. The weapon that looks like weakness. Of everything Jesus taught about how to walk through life without being broken, this may be the most counterintuitive and the most music liberating when it is actually understood. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 5:44. Every human instinct music runs in the opposite direction. When someone wounds you, the natural response is to protect yourself, to build a wall, to maintain a distance, to ensure they cannot reach you again. What almost no one considers is that refusing to forgive is not protection. It is a chain, and the person wearing it is you. As long as you carry hatred or resentment towards someone who hurt you, you remain bound to the moment of injury. You replay it. You rehearse what you should have said. You return to it involuntarily in quiet moments. The person who wounded you may have moved on entirely, but inside your interior world, they still have access, still showing up, still costing you something every time the memory resurfaces. Forgiveness does not minimize what was done. Music. It does not pretend the wound was not real or that the person deserves restoration to your trust. It does something more radical. It removes their ongoing access to your peace. It says, "What you did to me no longer has the right to determine how I carry myself today." Consider what unforgiveness actually costs a time. It requires energy to maintain, the energy of rehearsing the offense, of defending against the memory, of managing the places where the wound might be touched again. A person carrying sustained bitterness music is never fully present in any room they enter because part of them is always back in the moment of injury, building the case, nursing the record. The wound becomes a second life running parallel to the actual one, consuming resources, narrowing vision, keeping the heart in a defensive posture that gradually extends far beyond the original situation. The person who hurt you may long since have moved on. Music. You are still in the courtroom, still presenting evidence, still waiting for a verdict that is never going to come from a human source. Luke 23:34, Jesus on the cross, flesh torn, breath failing, music nails through his hands. "Father, "Forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This is not the prayer of someone in a comfortable position of moral superiority. This is a man in the center of the worst injustice music ever committed, at the moment of maximum pain, choosing to release the people responsible, music, rather than hold them in the grip of his legitimate grievance. He could have cursed them. He had every music right. He chose instead to speak their release, not because they deserved it, but because he refused to carry what hatred would have required him to carry. That prayer did not benefit his executioners in the moment. They did not hear it as absolution. It was spoken for him, to keep the bitterness from entering the only space the enemy had not yet been able, music, to touch, his interior. Romans 12:14, "Bless those who persecute music, you. Bless and do not curse." This is not moral advice designed to make you a better person in the abstract, which is a precise spiritual strategy. When you bless the person who hurt you, when you music actively, deliberately hand them to God, rather than holding them in your own grip, you break the mechanism by which the wound keeps reopening. You stop feeding the thing that is consuming your peace. This does not happen in a single act. For deep wounds, forgiveness is often a decision made repeatedly. Music, not because the first decision failed, but because the memory keeps returning, and each time it does, the choice must be made again. What changes over time is not that the memory stops coming. It is that its music authority over your interior life progressively diminishes. Each time you release rather than rehearse, the chain loses another link, and eventually, not immediately, not on your preferred timeline, but genuinely, the grip is gone. What was once a wound that defined you becomes a scar that testifies, and a scar is not damage. It is evidence that healing has already taken place. Love is not weakness, music. It is the posture of the unassailable. The person who has genuinely forgiven cannot music be reached by bitterness, cannot be controlled by the fear of being hurt again, and cannot be relocated by the opinions of those who wronged them. They have become, in the deepest sense, free, and free people are very difficult to break. Pick up this weapon. It looks, music, nothing like strength from the outside. From the inside, it is the most powerful thing you will ever do, for the war being fought in your own voice. Before the enemy ever touches your circumstances, he targets your music vocabulary. Not the words you speak to others, the words you speak to yourself when no one is listening. The running commentary that narrates your life in the privacy of your own mind. The sentences you have repeated so many times they have stopped feeling like opinions and started feeling like facts. Proverbs 18:21. The tongue has the power of life, music and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. This is not a verse about being careful with gossip. It is a statement about creative spiritual power. Words build and destroy, not only in the world around you, but in the world within you. Every declaration music you make about yourself, your situation, your future, is either planting or uprooting something in the interior soil where your faith lives. Declaring, "I will never recover from this," is not neutral. It is not just an emotional reaction to be managed. It is a seed, and if you let it repeat long enough without replacing it, it will produce exactly the harvest music it describes. A woman spent 9 years in a marriage that told her in 100 different ways what she was worth. When she finally left, she discovered that the physical departure was only the beginning of the real work. The apartment was new, the danger was gone. But every mirror felt like an argument, the reflection still carrying the voice of what she had been told she was for nearly a decade. She said afterward that it took longer to change what she believed about herself than it had taken to actually escape. The body leaves the place of harm long before the mind stops rehearsing it. The war she had to fight was not with her circumstances, but was with the sentences that had taken up residence inside her and kept paying music rent long after she had stopped inviting them in. Consistent inner declarations become the atmosphere you inhabit, not just emotionally, spiritually. They shape what you reach for, what you believe is possible, what you expect from God, what you allow yourself to receive. In Matthew Music 12:36, Jesus says that everyone will give account for every careless word spoken. The word translated careless in the Greek means idle, music unproductive, without purpose, words spoken without intention, words spoken out of habit rather than truth. He is not describing cruelty. He is describing the thoughtless rehearsal of things that undermine the life God is trying to build in you. In the wilderness, he demonstrated the alternative. Every time the enemy spoke to him, he did not respond from emotion or from the pressure, music of the moment. He responded with the word, "It is written." He had a declaration already prepared, not improvised under fire, but rooted in what he had received in the secret place. He did not argue with the assault. He replaced it with truth and moved on. Here is the model, not positive thinking, not motivational self-talk, the specific, deliberate replacement, music, of what the enemy says with what God has already declared. Your mouth speaking what heaven has spoken, first in private, consistently until the music interior voice begins to sound less like the wound and more like the Father. Change your inner vocabulary, not all at once. It does not work that way. One sentence at a music time. One declaration that is true when the false one rises. The fortress of your spirit is built or demolished word by word in the place where only God and you can hear what is being said. 5. The one thing, music, the enemy always attacks first. Before the enemy offers Jesus a kingdom, before he suggests turning stones to bread, before any specific temptation is presented, music he opens with this, "If you are the Son of God." Matthew 4:3. The structure of the attack is not primarily about what Jesus should do. It is about who he is. The enemy's first move, always, is to create uncertainty about identity, because he knows that a person who is not sure who they are can be moved by almost anything. Offer them an alternative definition, and they will consider music it. Apply enough pressure to the gap between what God said and what they can see, and the doubt will music do the work the assault never could. Jesus could not be reached by this because his identity had already been settled before he arrived in the wilderness. Matthew 3:17 at his baptism, music before his ministry, had produced a single visible result. Before he had healed anyone or taught anything or demonstrated music anything, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." The Father's declaration came before the evidence. The identity was music established before the performance. And when the desert came, and it came immediately after, there was nothing for the enemy to find purchase on. The question of who he was had already been answered by a voice the enemy could not counterfeit. Notice the sequence carefully. The declaration at the Jordan was not a reward for ministry accomplished. It was a foundation laid before ministry began. God was not saying, "You have proven yourself, so here is your identity." He was music, saying, "Here is who you are. Now go and live from it." The identity preceded the calling, sustained the calling, and could not be revoked by anything music that happened inside the calling. That is the architecture, not identity earned through performance and sustained through ongoing success. Identity given music before the test and held through it by the voice that gave it. Settled identity is the architecture of spiritual stability that almost nothing else can replicate. When you know who you are from the inside out, not from your track record, not from your feelings, not from the approval of the people in your life, you become remarkably difficult to destabilize. John 1:12, music. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become music children of God. Not the privilege, not the possibility, music the right. Legally, permanently, irrevocably established at the moment you received him. You are not auditioning for this position. You are not maintaining it through performance. It does not waver when your circumstances deteriorate or when you feel spiritually dry or when someone whose opinion you value decides you are not who you thought you were. Romans 8:16, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. The testimony is internal. It does not depend on external confirmation. The Spirit speaks it directly, music, into your own spirit, not as encouragement, but as fact, as the ground under every other thing you will ever stand on. When you know this, not as a concept you can explain, but as a settled reality you live from. The enemy loses his primary weapon. He can no longer use your circumstances to rewrite your identity. He can no longer use your failures to renegotiate your standing before God. He can no longer use the absence of visible confirmation to make you doubt whether God is with you. You are a child of the Most High. That was declared music before you did anything to deserve it, and it will stand after everything the enemy tries to do to take it from you. Return to it daily, not because you might forget it, but because identity watered consistently produces a rootedness that even the longest dry season cannot reach. The days you wake up and choose to realign with what God has declared before the world has a chance to offer its alternative definition. Those are the days the foundation is being reinforced, not dramatically, music not visibly, one quiet act of remembrance at a time, and the person who does this consistently becomes, over time, someone whose center cannot be found and moved by anything the day presents. Why the answer has not come yet? Among all the lies the enemy carries, the one that arrives in the silence of unanswered prayer may be the most corrosive. It does not come loudly, but arrives in the accumulation of days, in the gap between music, what you prayed, and what you can see, in the slow erosion of expectation, music, in the question you no longer ask aloud, because asking it has started to feel like weakness. Has God actually heard me? Romans 4:18. Music answers this from the life of a man who had every reason to stop believing. Abraham, when the evidence was entirely against him, when his body was as good as dead, music, and the promise had not moved in decades, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed music, and so became the father of many nations, just as it had been said to him, against all hope in hope. Those two phrases in the same sentence, the believing was not supported by what he could, music see, but was sustained by what he had heard. And that believing, that sustained, unresolved, apparently unrewarded faith, was precisely what God was using music to form something in him that the quick answer never could have built. Abraham became the father of faith, not at the moment the child arrived, but during the years the child did not. That is when the faith was tested, proven, and shipped into something that could carry not just one generation, but every generation that followed. The waiting was not the gap before the story began. The waiting was the story, and the person who emerged from those years of sustained trust was fundamentally different from the person who had entered them. More genuinely humbled, more thoroughly convinced that the promise rested on God's character and not on his own capability, more anchored in the word music than in any visible sign. These are not qualities that arrival produces. They are qualities that waiting, done in faithfulness, slowly and permanently builds. One of the least music preached and most important truths in the spiritual life is this: God does not always delay because he hasn't heard.